Buonasera a tutti gli ascoltatori e i partecipanti. Sono Gianmario Borio, il direttore dell'Istituto per la Musica della Fondazione Giorgio e benvenuti alla presentazione del volume Investigating Musical Performance, Theoretical Models and Intersections, di cui sono concuratore insieme a Giovanni Giuriatti, Alessandro Cecchi e Marco Luzzu, che saluto, così come saluto i nostri due presentatori della giornata odierna, Amanda Bailey e Enrique Camara Delanda. Bene, l'evento, questa manifestazione avrà luogo in lingua inglese per permettere appunto la partecipazione dei colleghi e di altri che eventualmente si collegheranno da altri paesi. So, hi again. Good afternoon. I am Gianmario Borio, the director of the Institute of Music of the Fondazione Giorgio in Venice. And welcome to everybody for our presentation, our launching of the book Investigating Musical Performance. Our presenters, Amanda Bailey and Enrique Camara de London, will introduce us to the main contents and problems related to the volume. And I will just say a couple of words regarding the history of this project, which took place along several years in collaboration with the Institute of Comparative Music Studies, which is the other Institute of Music of the Fondazione Giorgio. We began our collaboration in 2013 with two seminars in 2013 and 2014 with the title Investigating Musical Performance towards a conjunction of ethnographic and historiographic perspectives, which was also the title of the conference, of a conference which took place in July 2016. We worked together and in coordination with several other centers in Europe, working on the questions related to musical performance, such as the Research Center for Musical Performance as Creative Practice, University of Cambridge, and the project Musicals Ereignis, directed by Amanda Nuser at Humboldt University in Berlin, and the LabEx Graham Groupe de Recherche Expérimentale sur l'Art Musical, based in the Université de Strasbourg, and also the HRC, Interpersonal Entertainment in Musical Performance, based at the Durham University. So let me give the floor to Giovanni Giuriatti, who is the director of the Institute of Comparative Music Studies. Please, Giovanni.
Thank you very much, Gianmario. Yes, it was, I think, a very fruitful project of cooperation, first of all, between our two institutes within the Fondazione Cini that converged in dealing with a topic of common interest. And so I'm very pleased of this, this cooperation. And actually, in ethnomusicology, performance, the study of performance has been always present, but somehow hidden or underlying as music of oral tradition is always dealing with performing acts and practices, but new analytical methods and new technological tools were available recently. And so that stirred again some interest in the issue. And in historical musicology, study of performance was something new. That's what we thought, especially with the performative turn. And we thought that it could have been useful to get together between ethnomusicologists and historical musicologists and reflect upon these new trends together. And so we did, as Gianmario remembered, just recalled in the first seminars, but it became apparent that historical ethnomusicology, musicology and ethnomusicology were not alone, and we had to take into account also other approaches and fields of studies within musicology, or neighboring disciplines like media studies, performance studies, the studies in popular music, and to organize some interaction among all these experts that took place in the final seminars, and of which there is trace also in this volume. Just to mention the main issues here we have dealing with is social interaction that has been explored in different way in the relationship between composer and performer, but also in various capacities within the realm of ethnomusicologists, including audience and anyone who participates in a performative event. And of course, taking into account such instances in live or in mediated context. So a lot have been involving around social interaction. Cook reminded us that performance is inevitably a social act. Another issue that we really explore is that of music embodiment and gesture in relation to expression and emotion. That it's also gesture considering its broad meaning, actual gesture as in opera or in Indian classical music, but also in a more metaphoric or symbolic meaning and acception. And also another important part of this volume, I think, is the analytical approach on which we really stressed upon with new semiographic systems, the use of video, multimedia, graphic animation in several capacities, including, of course, the analysis of recordings that has becoming a fundamental tool in all this. But I don't want to take more space and room, anticipate what the presenters will say. So I thank also very much the presenters and Fondazione Cini. And I will leave the floor now to Amanda Bailey to present the book and start telling us. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for the introduction, and Gianmario. So in view of the short time frame that I've had the book, I should just explain to people watching that it only arrived on an online form on Thursday. So I've really rushed through a lot of it. But I have read through all the first 3 parts of the book. So that's what most of my comments pertain to. And I've noticed, having just had access to the chapters earlier today, then I see that there are some things that I've raised that are actually partly addressed in those. So that will lead to some fuller discussion as well. So I'm afraid my points, because of that, I suppose my points are going to come across as perhaps more of a list than a scholarly woven narrative, possibly a bit disjointed and stilted quite apart from any oversight. So I'm happy to be corrected for any of those things I may have missed. So I perhaps didn't find as many theoretical models that the title of the book implies, but there were plenty of intersections, and especially regarding the cross-disciplinary studies of the last decades. Some of these are explicit, others implicit. However, I'd like to think that the future for musical performance studies could involve more co-authorship across disciplines as well. And I've extracted some points about the aims of the book that struck me as particularly useful and timely. For example, many authors have undertaken a valuable comparison and revision of theoretical and analytical paradigms, some of whom were carefully and courageously re-evaluating or critiquing their earlier work. And I'm thinking in particular of Philip Auslander and Janet Schmulfeld. And that was particularly helpful and revitalizing. Martin Clayton provides an eye-opening first chapter that does a magnificent job, I thought, bringing together the approaches of ethnomusicology and historical musicology to investigating musical performance. And he opens up the question of whether it is possible to conduct a data-rich, quantitative and comparative study of musical performance without implying an urge to control others by forcing diverse practices into the straitjacket of a common frame of reference. And they're his words. He summarizes the factors shared between disciplines, such as technological developments, and points to his own research to demonstrate that disciplinary divergence need not continue indefinitely, explaining that the increasing ease of using digital video assists this endeavor. So Clayton states that the conditions, quote, conditions now exist that create possibilities for fruitful interactions among historical musicologists, ethnomusicologists, and psychologists, and that there is no reason why the full range of technological and analytical tools now available cannot be applied across a very broad range of musical expressions, end quote. So taking that a stage further leads me to reference the work I'm actually doing as a member of the research team on the ERC-funded project, Interactive Research in Music as Sound, known as IRIMAS, that's the acronym for it, and that's led by Michael Clark at the University of Huddersfield. So its aim in that project is to harness the potential of 21st century technology to research interactive oral approaches to music analysis and to musicology more broadly. The project significantly expands ideas and techniques previously explored by Michael Clark in the context of electroacoustic music in the AHRC-funded project Technology and Creativity in Electroacoustic Music, and his earlier work on interactive oral analysis. It also develops the idea of non-linear analysis of composition, rehearsal, and performance, particularly in the multimedia software DVD that Michael and I worked on previously in 2009. So the IRIMAS project is devising generic software tools and specific case studies to develop and demonstrate the potential of working with software to facilitate direct engagement with music as sound as part of musicological research. And the reason I mention the IRIMAS project in this context is because it is applicable across the whole range of different musics. So I'm working on a case study tracking the creative process in free improvisation. And there are case studies on spectralism in the field of contemporary art music and folk songs in performance in the field of ethnomusicology. But of course, rather than focusing on performance per se, its focus is on sound. It aims to transform approaches to musicology by moving away from a primarily fixed text-based approach towards one that incorporates as an integral feature the interactive and aural, spelled A-U-R-A-L. This chimes very much with some of the authors in investigating musical performance. For example, in terms of an emphasis on social interaction, Timothy Taylor, analysis of musical gesture, and nonlinear analysis. By moving from traditional textual bias of much musical research, the IRIMAS project should lead to new enhanced modes of musicological knowledge. And unlike current digital musicology, which uses software primarily to extract quantized data, IRIMAS takes interactive engagement with sound as a foundation for research. So Timothy Taylor's concluding sentence in his chapter provides the most profound food for thought. He says, as societies around the world change with ever greater rapidity, attending to questions concerning the struggles over value and the preservation of it become increasingly urgent. And there are many intersections between chapters. For example, Taylor's explication of value is not exhausted with the conclusion of the performance because he says musicians continue to act learning from previous performances, building on them, aiming toward the next one. Public display is some sort of performance. And this couldn't be more apparent than from the experience of adjudicating performers that John Rink discusses in his chapter. For Taylor, the value of all these actions is realized in the moment of performance. Performance can only serve as a medium of value when it occurs as a performance for or with others in public. So given the appropriate and important move of bringing together contributions of both historical musicologists and ethnomusicologists, I had expected to see a problematization of the term performance. Taylor's chapter provides a useful definition of the value of performance, saying value, like meaning, is social, it circulates everywhere and everywhere, it is contested, protected, shifting. And this made me reconsider the extent to which the use of the word performance, or to which we use the word performance, when for some cultures that term may not be appropriate and ritual or ceremony may be more relevant. Conversely, there are social values to attribute to ceremonies, rituals, or events, which local people might not attribute to the category of performance. And I'm thinking of cremation ceremonies in Bali, as one example that I happen to have witnessed myself. But to an outsider, the whole affair might be considered a performance, including the very elaborate preparations, which might be regarded as performative. So who decides what constitutes a performance? This may be a point to follow up in discussion. And since having that thought yesterday, as I was trying to condense some of these ideas, I noticed from my recent access to the online chapters today that Alessandro Cecchi and Marco Luzzu address this point partly, and which brings me to the question of the role of the online chapters also in relation to the printed book. So that's something perhaps we can discuss. So moving to Martin Schertzinger's chapter on music's technochronemics, he states that the analytics for a performance-oriented study of music's production, reproduction, and circulation are today suspended between two paradigms: the methodological inclinations of musicology on the one hand, and ethnomusicology on the other. I just wonder how useful it is to continue to separate these two paradigms when there's so much to be shared between them, or at least as well, there should be some sharing. And the recent turn in music studies towards performance was one attempt to mediate between this. Yes, this is Schertzinger again saying this. The recent turn in music studies towards performance was one attempt to mediate between and moderate the exaggerated claims located at the poles of this opposition. However, as I questioned for Taylor, this assumes that performance is always an appropriate category for ethnomusicology. So that's just something I'm kind of questioning as I read. Acknowledgement of the unfamiliar, for example, by Clayton, Taylor, John Rink, and possibly others, made me surprised that in the chapters I read, there was no reference to Henry Stobart's article, Unfamiliar Sounds, Approaches to Intercultural Interaction in the World's Musics, where he uses familiarity and unfamiliarity as thinking tools. He says, quote, "The effective balancing of the familiar and unfamiliar seems to be at the heart of most successful music making and communication," asking whether this might even be a universal. In relation to the focus of part 2 of investigating musical performance, Henry Stobart rightly questions the degree to which a given mode of cultural hearing can always be said to be correct or incorrect by considering aspects of power dynamics and cultural mixing or adaptation. He advises that we need to consider how notions of power and authority impact on hierarchies of perception and misperception during transmission processes. And I would argue that their hierarchies of perception and misperception apply equally during any evaluation of musical performance. And he asks whose perceptions dominate in given contexts. So relevant to some of the thinking in investigating musical performance, Stobart says it is often precisely the distinctive, unanticipated, or even idiosyncratic elements in an individual or group that brings to or even idiosyncratic elements an individual or group brings to a performance or composer to a piece that mark it out as musically engaging. Now, there's quite a long quote from him I'm going to read because I think, again, it's relevant across several of the chapters. He says, "However, let us not forget that the degree to which the introduction of unfamiliar elements is welcomed varies immensely according to context and tradition. It is also important to stress that such elements, which may be seen to reflect the identity of performers, whilst possibly representing a form of alterity to certain listeners, must be adequately framed within the familiar. We often welcome and even celebrate unfamiliar elements when introduced into a familiar environment in which we feel secure, in control, and are able to orientate ourselves. However, predominantly alien environments, musical and other, in which we are unable to recognize, reproduce, or respond appropriately to structures, patterns, or modes of expression, or in which our ignorance or powerlessness is made manifest, may provoke feelings of insecurity, disorientation, and anxiety, as well as negative evaluations. Perceptions of the unfamiliar depend on subject position, and it is important to consider how other people might perceive or conceive of the music that you or I consider familiar, as well as how you or I might perceive or conceive of music that we consider culturally unfamiliar. Clearly, each reader will have their own graduated, shifting, and context-sensitive conceptions and perceptions of familiar and unfamiliar musics. So that's a lengthy quote from Henry Stowell. So despite this focus on performance in the 3 E chapters, I couldn't see actually any E resources of performances. So I wonder if that's a missed opportunity here. And I'm thinking that for Janet Schmalfeld's chapter, for one example, but others too, and especially in part 4 of the book. In relation to John Kovac's chapter, I'm more familiar with the ideal listening position being considered from the point of view of an audience member rather than from the point of view of a musician. And John Rink's reflection of seeing the film of Kate Huey's performance on the screen at an airport, compared with being at the back of a concert hall, has quite significant implications for the way performance is perceived and mediated. Anyhow, John Kovac's chapter focuses on positioning listening among performers, the performer as a distinct kind of listener. He distinguishes aesthetic positioning between a listener focusing on a single part from performance positioning, a performer playing a specific part. He says that these 2 forms of listening are closely related, but should nonetheless be kept distinct. What's problematic for me is why is it even relevant or appropriate to talk about the ideal listening position? How, for a performer, how the listener generally and the performer specifically is consciously and purposefully directed within the texture. Even though Kovac cites participatory listening from Simon Frith, this seems to presume that a performer adopts one position and sticks to that position perhaps within a performance or for a specific amount of time. So I've yet to be convinced about that. And maybe that's another discussion point we can return to. I was slightly troubled by one of the subheadings in Pierre Michel's chapter, collaborations with musicians and composers, because that kind of implies that composers are not musicians. But that's just a minor thing, really. But I particularly welcomed Michel's discussion of specific rhythmic languages which rely in part on a culture that has come down to us via an orally transmitted culture that includes swing and groove. These, he says, can hardly be studied rationally by theorists. To me, he says, this really helps to reinforce the need to form collaboration between theorists and musicians. Michel concludes that, quote, a contemporary musical work does not exist in a vacuum. The musician does not analyze things in the same way as a musicologist. Today, a balance needs to be found between the texts and the indications of composers and performers, end quote. So this has been reflected in the increasing amount of work being done with composers and performers and incorporating their voices into musicology or ethnomusicology, and has been done for a little while now, for example, with Eric Clark, Nicholas Cook, Bryn Harrison, and Philip Thomas, by Eric Clark and Lisa Lim, another example, and in my own work, of course, with Michael Finnessy and the Kreutzer Quartet. In fact, there's one relevant example I'm going to share now with on my screen in relation to the work Hans Zender is cited in Pierre Michel's chapter. And that's regarding ergonomics and choreography in relation to expression in performance. So give me one moment and I hope. Can you see the score part there? Yeah, great. So in this first few bars of Finnes's second string quartet, the first violinist decided that he needed to have truth to each line, as he put it. So he gave each line of his violin part its own integral fingering, which is not necessarily technically possible with the other lines' integral fingering. This was to emphasize the counterpoint as two disparate things being put together. And the violinist's decision demonstrates a choreographic rather than an ergonomic approach to fingering that fits Eric Clark's identification of a continuum from ergonomics to choreography for fingering as well as for other body movements in performance. I also liked Michel's suggestion that the idea of workshops. Yes, so that point about the choreography related to one of the Pierre Michel's points in his chapter. And I also like Michel's suggestion that the idea of workshops with conductors and musicians should be developed to open up other paths of research. He advocates that a certain number of works or performances should be studied from the viewpoint of live performance or rehearsal. It seems appropriate at this point to reference my work, in that case, on the project Beyond East and West. This includes composer-performer discussions. That's at top left-hand and bottom right, and recording sessions of individual instruments and a variety of workshops. The ensemble at the heart of this project is the Hesarfen Ensemble, a contemporary music ensemble of Western classically trained musicians based in Istanbul, developed by the composer Michael Ellison of the University of Bristol. And he's the principal investigator on this project. Members of the Hesarfen Ensemble are joined by players of Turkish instruments, the ney, kanun, kemençe, and balama and kaval, for a series of intense workshops that took place 4 times a year from 2016 to 2020. In the first workshop, the musical content was led by the kemençe player and the ney player. And apart from explaining the maqams and demonstrating the pitches that make up the tetrachords and pentrachords, the kemençe player explained that it's the flow and the relationship between the sounds within a scale that's important. In this context, I want to refer back to page 3 of the introduction to your book and question the points made about transcriptions. The authors state that that transcriptions have been replaced by more dynamic methodologies of representation and analysis, able to better explain on a minimal timescale the differences that are a fundamental part of analytical procedures applied to performance. Now, we might discuss how you use that word transcription, but I would argue that there is still an important role for transcription. And in my work, the act of transcription has proved important for both composers and performers as a way of learning an unfamiliar musical style. And since we are talking about performance, I think we should actually hear some music. So in this extract, on the next slide, actually, no, this slide is one, yes, where we actually have the kemençe and the ney player there's learning how to play from notation, which they don't normally do, with the conductor in that picture. And that's in one of the workshops. And the next slide. So in this extract, the violinist and scholar, you can see here, Murat Gürel, instructs the ensemble musicians by playing from his highly detailed transcriptions, which are based on the performance style of a master of Turkish classical music from the 17th century, Buhurizade Mustafa İçri. This example shows him explaining how to read, listen, copy, and play his annotations. So where you can see the small letters here, GLG means glissando grace, F vib means fast vibrato, and U before TR means uncertain trill. So this passage that you're going to hear now focuses on the bar with the red outline, and then there's one repetition during the extract which begins from the upbeat to the previous line that isn't on this page. So I'm just going to hopefully all... Yeah. So I'm just going to try that again. Okay, I'll carry on. I don't think that's going to work properly. Never mind. Hopefully you can see there the purpose of the transcription anyway in this context. And there are many other instances outside this project where transcription contributes to an intercultural performance practice. Sometimes with players making their own annotations on a basic melody because the style of performance relies on what is not in the notation. So here one of the performers actually annotated the basic notes of the maqam to make it more playable for them. So. But through these detailed transcriptions, Murat has found a way to communicate what happens between the notes, or the flow and the relationship between sounds that I mentioned that the Kemençe player had identified as being so important. So I would argue that both the act of transcribing and the playing of transcriptions improves orality, spelt either way, because it forces us to listen differently and more intently, relating, of course, to the second part of the book. I'm intrigued to know more the purpose of the e-chapters and their relationship with the rest of the book. But I thank you for giving me the opportunity to read your wonderful work and giving me the chance to respond in some specific ways, though sadly, perhaps not as comprehensively as I would have liked. So the book has a great deal to offer postgraduate students and research students especially. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda, for your stimulating reading of the parts of the book that you have had the possibility to read. It is very stimulating and also make us reflect about many aspects. Performance is an enormous topic. And with methodological intersection, and also intersection of different people, with different scholars, with different backgrounds, we thought we achieved a differentiated network. But of course, I notice now this question of transcriptions is totally central for all the repertoires taking into consideration. But I guess we will discuss about these questions later on. Let me give the floor to Enrique Camara de Landa for his presentation, and then we will go on with the discussion of both introductory talks. Please, Enrique.
Thank you, Gianmario. First of all, I want to thank Professor Giuriati and the other editors, Gianmario Bori, Alessandro Tecchi, and Marco Lustu, for the invitation to participate in this meeting, and above all this, to read this interesting book, which contained the result of a series of initiatives. I wish I had more time just for reading. I received the book some days ago, but what I was reading was so interesting, exciting for me. So I promise I will continue in next days. I agree with Amanda Bailey's assessment of the book, and I find the ideas she has presented here very interesting. And I consider, first of all, this interdisciplinarity extremely enriching. The convergence and the complementarity of disciplines related to the study of musical objects and practice is a principle that important scholars have communicated to me as early as in the 80s. Diego Carpitella, Roberto Leidi, Tulia Magrini, Gilbert Rouget, among others, when I interviewed them about these tales. So, seeing my Spanglish is very pure, let me please read some of my notes. Let me refer to the specifically ethnomusicological text of the volume, since we do not have time to comment on all the context. The editors of the volume explain in the introduction that in ethnomusicology, bodily movement is considered in relation to both surface aspect and deep structure of musical practices as a feature that marks a specific culture, a genre or style of a single musician. Social practices have implications not only for the emotional states of the participant in a specific event, but also for changes in the customs and collective ways of feeling in certain social groups. And remember that one important goal of the project, which struck me, was to explore new and interdisciplinary ways of analyzing performance. For example, the interplay between musicians as well as between musicians and the other participants in a performance. So Amanda was talking about empirical methods in the study of musical performance, and Martin Clayton starting article, which I found very, very interesting. He starts observing the limits of both ethnographical and historiographical research, resulting in a separate tradition of empirical research ranging from psychology of music to empirical musicology. So he addressed the place occupied in both disciplines by empirical methodologies, intended as those involving the analysis of quantitative performance data, describing, for instance, timing, pitch, loudness, or movement, something that we are not able to do sometimes. I was in Morocco working on music and trance, impossible to take some kind of, or to do some kind of research. But it's very interesting, his histories of empirical methods in historical musicology and ethnomusicology respectively, and his way of going into more detail on a selection of sources relating to rhythm and timing, which he considers to be helpful to highlight some of the reason for the disciplinary divergence. So I think some elements and some context, some cultural context would be better or more useful for us to be in the interdisciplinarity way, and some others perhaps it would be not so easy, no? The author mentions, among other initiatives and publications, Sorbonne's Experimental Psychology Laboratory, Carsy's short monography, The Psychology of Musical Talent, the volume Psychology of Music, and point out that the chapter on primitive music, and he expresses great enthusiasm for the potential of sound film as a research tool, and as the Berlin School for work of Stone von Horbostel, in particular, displaying an interest in psychological issues such as pitch perception, psychological interest or interest, psychological way of looking that now is coming back again with new perception and with new tools and new questions. So he talks about Charles Mayer, Miller, Mstislav Kolinsky, analysis of tempo, Charles Kite, theory of participatory discrepancies within jazz musicians, and we quickly think in participatory discrepancies in other cultures, for sure. Alan Lomax, Blacking, etc. I have been writing a lot of things that I am not going to read now because I think I prefer to go to not chapter 2 and chapter 12, Sentimental Gesture and the Politic of Shapes, in the performance of Al-Halim Hafiz by Martin Stokes, which he departs from the performative turn in musicology that has made questions about the performing body inescapable and uses the more recent turn to shape and the application of the concept of habitus by Bourdieu, of the Politic of Gesture. He proposes the category of sentimental gesture, which I find very interesting, meaning by sentimental firstly, performativity in which emotion is self-conscious, reflexive, and stage. We all know how emotion is a new argument, a new interest in both musicology and ethnomusicology. Secondly, performativity that is entangled with the modern world's anxieties about emotion, their mediation and their authenticity. I could put this on authenticity. As a case study, he presents the sentimental gestural work of Al-Halim Hafiz, which was a crooner, no? After whose singing career was deeply implicated in Nasser revolution in Egypt. Stokes identifies some trait of the singer. First, he was identified by his gestures of is a special case that had a viral quality, mimicked and reproduced across various media. Second, they were reflexive and self-aware. Thirdly, they were entangled with the media system, dispositive. He said that it's impossible to think on his gestures without microphones or cinemascope technologies, blah, blah, blah. Fourthly, they indexed the laboring poor black body contorted in effort. He was called the Dark Nightingale, I think. So the connotations were very clear. And the author considers some gender issues and the disjuncture between musical gesture and textual gesture. He does musical analysis of the song, and he considers the length and soundscape of the instrumental introduction, the complexity of the Macam modal modulatory scheme, and the sense of building to a clear climax through a quasi-harmonic drive at the end. He also approaches in terms of his poetic and narrative structures. And it's interesting, he explained always his methodology. Sometimes it looks new, sometimes not. He spent an afternoon watching a version of the song with a friend, also an ethnomusicologist and vocalist of the Egyptian song tradition, discussing how gesture directed the sound wall on the performance. Yes, for me, it was very interesting to work with musicians in India, looking together to their performances and recording what they were saying or remembering what they are commenting on that. For sure, it's nothing very much new. Okay. I quote, he said, the question of who or what has musical power, another big theme now, in such performance is, however, full of ambiguities, as a gestural analysis quickly reveals. So it's interesting, he is not marrying only one of the possible hermeneutical approaches, but he talk about these ambiguities, no? Which when we are working with mixed reality, we are always like mathematical limits, no? Going to, but never approaching exactly what we are trying to explain or to understand. And I think gestures are particularly aspect in which the meaning and the resemantizations and the different meanings can be confusing us or forward going us to some kind of interpretation, no? So he sees the tension between the two organizing principles, one supplied by the poem, the other by the norms and convention of song performance, that are articulated at the gestural level in the last half of the performance. He discusses too the conflict relationship between the singer and the poetry, and he concludes that Abd al-Halim gestures draw a line between the sentimental singer and the modernist poet. But, okay, gesture here is seen as an element of tension between what he said, two distinct and delineated Arab modernism. One represented here as the lyrics, transgressive and sexualized, the other, the way of singing, urban and sentimental. That for me are not opposite, or it can be complementary ways of doing, I think, no? So Stokes, he proposed to locate a subtle post-colonial politics in this troubling, since the gesture of this singer acknowledged these ambiguities. No? I was very interested too in chapter 13, marking the sum, talent, tempo, and gesture in Kayal performance, since I was working in Carnatic music, she was working in Kayal, in Hindustanic, and she investigated whether the gestural expression of the first beat of the rhythmic cycle, the sum, can be affected by tempo and meter, and whether its observation can reveal insights into the way musicians conceive and experience their music. So the methodology is grounded in the analysis of video footage of public concert, She first contextualized the practice of clapping along with the rhythmic cycle in Hindustani classical music. Then she considered theoretical and methodological background, and she analyzes 3 case studies featuring performance in 11 Khayal composition and respective improvisation. She concludes that gestures performed on the psalm may be influenced by tempo and meter and may be dependent on the way singers manage and structure their performance. I find very interesting this. I know every one of us, if I want to sing, it's better. If I can do that, I will succeed for sure better than, no? But the problem is always finding the meanings. That is very interesting that she worked with 3 different cases and different Khayal, and she discusses comments and statements from the musicians. And she superimposes photos on them making gestures and staves, describing the gestures of each tal and raga. So in the discussion, she can confirm an overall consistency across the gestures made by the singer at the occurrence of the psalm. She confirms that gesture's metered performance can be affected by melodic movement and some other issues related. Something that is impression that you have from the very beginning, but it's interesting to have studies in which someone who is very deep in this tradition, like Laura Leante, try to just not justify, just to find some proof, some elements that goes to this awareness of the singers and the level of explicitly guiding the performance or the other musician. I consider that she contributes to the investigation of the relationship between gesture, tempo, and meter, and to a better understanding of how musicians conceive and experience their music. And she concludes that gesture performed on the psalm appears to be affected by a tal clapping pattern, even when this pattern is not displayed entirely by the singer, and that tempo too might affect gesture. She discusses the possibility for hand movements to mark a kind of gestural identity of different composition or section of the music. I wish her to succeed on that, because I find it very exciting, but very, very difficult to find, because, intercultural ways of interpreting some gestures, even intracultural, because I remember the musician, the Prince of Kerala, telling us that in Germany, this, and then the newspaper say, oh, the leader of the group was not very convinced, because, okay, if you are inside the culture, you know what this can explain or can mean, what that means, no? And the same for the gestures. So it's very interesting, this way in which all the authors of the volume are talking after being making research very deeply on the culture, subculture, style, musicians, and relationship between musicians and audience, etc. No? Chapter 14, Lokapanka, Analysis, Structure, Performance, and Meaning of a Temple Song in Nepal, by Richard Wedesai, find very interesting too. He's talking about sacred song performed by farmers together every evening in Bhaktapur, that's a splendid place that was a little destroyed by, earthquake. And they are accompanying themselves on cymbals, drum, and natural trumpet, reading the poems in manuscript songbooks, while the melodies are transmitted by oral tradition and repeated many times in antiphonal alternation with changes of rhythm, tempo, and instrumental accompaniment. So it's a different situation respect the first one. Wides analyzes one particular song on which he explains the history, the meaning, local meaning, because it's a song for a goddess, which is related to Hindu god Shiva in his role of patron of music and dance. And one of the verse lines is addressed to a king too. And he explains the literary and musical structure. He presents the musical transcription in Western notation, not Sargam and nothing more. He describes the spatial disposition, a schema on the musical form and performance elements. He suggests two areas of cultural signification that can be inferred from the performance practice of this tapa. The first is complementarity and reciprocity that are present in many aspects of the local society, in contrast with the hierarchies and asymmetries of a general society. So he's looking to this special group and local society, but taking into account he's not making generalization on the society, for sure. And the second is the intensification, auditory attention and flow, melodic processes of intensification, which we could find in other places related to trance and, as here is happening, the psychological flow states and the therapical consequences, no? Mental states variously described as absorption, heightened feeling, ecstasy, etc. So he concludes that the song has both the quality of artifact and performance, lyrics and written sources with history, but song lives only by performance. So he observes the combination of literary schema, verse form, metrical schema, tal, modal, contour schema, all marking a performance schema. Very interesting. Performance schema is more than everything together. It's a little more because it includes antiphonal repetition, tempo change. They are growing and growing, and then some moment suddenly they start again, and this provokes some consequence and some reaction on people. So this performance engaged the spatial schema of the sitting arrangement of its performance, spatial states of mean and temporal experience, and cultural patterns extending far beyond the activity of singing. So he quotes the statement, of the singer about the therapeutic effect of the performance, since the word sung plus the whole activity of singing, including the ritual action and social interaction occurring in any singing session, bring peace of mind. So intercultural differences are overcome in this kind of consequences of music. I remember some similar experiences in Andean countries, in Andean areas of Argentina related to Buenos Aires, in which the meaning was not well interpreted in Buenos Aires, and people going to living in Buenos Aires, then singing that songs were telling to me what they expected me to listen. So they were changed. They were like, you can say, quaderni del carcere, how is the author? This way of, just taking the discourse of the person. Overcoming all these distances is something I find very interesting in this article, and find very interesting and enriching the each chapters accompanying part one. For example, Alessandro Cecchi and Marco Luzzu start by pointing out that no single corresponding term can be found in many other languages for performance, and offer an historical overview of ethnomusicological research on musical performance today. They take many authors, some other authors are there, so they do it all. Of course, they do a selection of that, no? The historical overview, for example, they made by Marco, the first contribution of ethnomusicology to the study of musical performance, from the very beginning, use of recording, transcription, and analysis, Horbostel, motor patterns on xylophones, musical gesture, Bartok, and so on. the centrality of performance in ethnomusicology that he said perhaps it's because of that they didn't needed to open an organic theoretical reflection on the topic, even if some books had been written many decades ago. Many studies on specific cultures always with ethnographic approach in order to understand music in relation to other aspects of culture by doing field work and observant participation. And he writes that the ethnographic approach can be considered as the main contribution ethnomusicology has made to the study of musical performance through three main analytical perspectives. The first consists in elaborating analytical models useful for identifying the set of rules of a musical system through the comparison between a certain number of executions, which is always necessary and not enough, perhaps. The differentiation between ideal version, the transcendent abstract ideas of all performances, and the real version, the momentarian, MacLeod, Konstantin Brailovsky, Blackim, Aaron Kaubik, Paul Berlin, and Giuriatti, and others. The second approach is investigating how the human body is involved in both music and dance. So Merriam, Blackim, Carpitella, Bailey, Kubik, and so on, Ketia, Seeger, Lothar Jacob, Dana Rappaport, talking on polymusic too, Laura Lucas, Giuriatti again. The third approach is to analyze the relationship between sound and context, so Frisby, Herndon, MacLeod, Behag, etc. The concept of cultural performance, Singer, Abraham for pure performance, Herndon for music occasion, Ash Aston for musical event, MacLeod for the relationship between content and context, Feld, Qureshi, Seeger, Tighton, etc. So very, very interesting for having a very big panorama on the fourth category of Tonturino, participatory performance, presentational performance, high creativity, and studio audio art, Alejandro Madrid, Schechner, etc. So ethnomusicologists considering political power, internal contradictions between society, gender, race, and modernity. The authority of the researchers is reviewed. Deborah Wong's idea of performative ethnography too. The relationship of ethnomusicology with cognitive sciences, computational studies for empirical analysis, audiovisual tools, studies in relationship between musicians and audience, competence and interaction in music, etc., etc. I will not continue with very, very much things. So by musicality, I could say by or polymusicality, no? Sometimes it's more than two. Stephen Feld composing songs in the Kaluli style, Stanton, blah, blah, blah. Very interesting, the overview of recent research by Zeki, I will not deal with. I go just to say some words about the text of Giovanni Giuriatti. I like it very much. His not ancient, his text some decades ago on the kaleidoscopic work in the Tarantella of Montemarano. And I found very interesting when you go back to a place in which you are a kind of insider, because he plays the accordion and he had been an insider even before, and he's considered to Regula Qureshi works on Pakistan Qawwali, this small model that try to connect music score with what is happening in the place. I find it very interesting, but I think some step forward should be done after her proposal in order to find really a more close articulation between these two meta languages talking about what is happening. No? Okay, you understand me. I think it's very interesting, the Qureshi works, It is a starting point, I think. So Giorgio knows that recent significant studies on performance have highlighted the fact that music's life lies at the moment in which musicians and listeners and dancers are involved and embodied as an interactive oral experience, interactive, so going and back, no, going like in India, you know. And through performance, they construct meaning together. Very interesting thing. So performance studies must dialogue with other musicological approach in order to be most fruitful and effective. The focus of the chapter is on how the analysis of performance can be seen as linking factor between a detailed formal musical analysis, which we are not abandoning. Some people say that, okay, not anymore formal musical analysis. And then you go to the field and musicians say, why not? We are musicians. So he talks about linking this detailed formal musical analysis and the larger framework of the context in which a specific music is performed. So he considered the interactions among musicians, between them and the dancer, between musicians and those who are listening to the music, so different levels of participation, the fact that a lineage of musicians can be reconstructed, each with his own melodies, some more innovative than others, I am quoting, with their own specific sound that can immediately be detected by a competent listener. It happened to me in the Andean countries in which the differences between two musicians were quickly understood and recognized by them, but I had very difficult, very much problem to write on this. Just Blacking told us that, no? So Giorgio told us that phenomena like the movements of the dancers toward the musicians in order to absorb the sound, or the role musicians playing in regulating the emotional flow of the masquerade. Relationship with space, too, taking into account the concept of polymusic proposed by Rapoport, the association of a specific music to different parts of the historic district of Monte Marano. Sorry, Giovanni, I am always finding similarities with the Andean countries in which groups goes and they are giving meaning or recognizing special meanings, shared meanings of some places through the music. No? And first time you don't understand that, sure. So I quote you, a study of the space of the musical performance can also give us meaningful insight into the patterns of change of a society and of how a community gives meaning to its social space, including a fundamental diachronic perspective who gives meaning to the meaning. So diachronic dimension, the introduction of the clarinet, giving more importance to an increase of sound volume, or the fascination that the neo-folk revival has for Italian audiences, La Notte della Taranta you talk about. And he concludes by giving a description of a concrete situation as an example of the way in which the theoretical kaleidoscope model drawn from the formal analysis, while enabling the musicians to choose with some important margin of freedom their musical path, is adapted through the performance to the different needs and functions of the music in relation to the feast. I am sure that Giovanni will continue going to Monte Marano, and we will be making some tune of Spreu in the future. So I am too long, so I am not going further. I was writing some notes on musical persona, Goffman, sociological approach, and some other things. And Kovacs article, very interesting too, that even if, okay, he talks at the end, rather than position a single and unified view of any given passage, saying Kovacs on the rock concert, texture or piece, positional analysis suggests that at least some music offer multiple analytical perspectives, and that none of these perspectives can be privileged over the other. If I take this only thinking on the plays, I should take into account not only musicians, but all the sound systems, all the technology, but I think he does, so no problem with that. And okay, it's okay for that. And I thank you very much for your passion. I was talking a little quickly and perhaps you did not understand my terrible Spanish, so sorry for that. But we can just discuss something now. So thank you again, and my compliments. I will continue to read this book with very big interest, me and my students.
Thank you, Enrique. We understood you. And this is very interesting. The many aspects that you have found in, especially in the ethnomusicological approaches, but also this question of positional listening, positional analysis. I will tell something more because this later on, because this connects also with a topic which Amanda focused on our talk. But Alessandro and Marco were many times mentioned, so let me give to one of them the floor. I don't know, Alessandro, would you like to begin with some of your comments?
Yes, I can comment. I will mainly refer to my my research line, so that I think that we have to understand to this book as a repository of different line of research. It was a collection of representative of many important projects around the world in that period. So it is in some way a book that comes after the performative turn and try to focus on theoretical models. I think the investigating is interesting in this title because it is a way to say that the focus of the book is how we have to investigate in a theoretical and the theoretical part of the reasonment is, in my view, the main point. It is not really a book on making of musical performance, but about the reflecting on musical performance, what is the best approach towards some specific and special things. For example, Auslanders comes from performance studies, and this is a very interesting field because it was one possible connection between ethnomusicology and popular music studies and art music, because in some way this reference to a concept of performance which is not strictly related to music, but is the performance is a kind of self-presentation of the performer and not only of the music. And it's very interesting how the sound of performance in a performance studies perspective is in some way connected to the whole of the bodily movement and cognition and the emotion of the performer. I think this is a possible line. For example, we can read Auslander's chapter in the line of his thoughts. So it is a kind of reconsideration of an early article, and he comes to see the relation between self-presentation and acting no more as a dichotomy, but as a kind of continuum. This is very useful also in my research. I think this is independent of the ethnomusicological or historical musicological approach of this divide, something which can connect. The same is true for John Kovac's approach to situated listening, I would say, or positional analysis, which is, of course, interesting because it is not only a matter of perception, but also of proper perception, that the performer is in performance. So he has or she has a listening point, which is something which have to be taken into account for analysis. I think this is also a very relevant point this chapter, which also can be understood in the frame of Kovac's reflection, which I think the interesting thing is that the intersection had some result, at least on my personal research. For example, I was very interested by many of these chapters and was in some way very happy to know more about these authors. For example, I found in Richard Widdes many interesting approaches to improvised music, to improvisation, which he is using something very similar to the schema theory as in Leante's chapter. I think it's very productive. I was trying to take this theory, which came in the field of ethnomusicology, and try to transfer it to other art music. And I found many inputs. And I think it's very useful to see to try this methodological combination, because it's very useful. Another interesting chapter is that of Marianne Smart, where she is addressing radical staging. This is the role of the gesture not only as a complement of music, but in some respect also an autonomous line, which of course in the emergent meaning of musical performance, this autonomy is something which becomes part of a whole. So it is not possible to read it as an autonomous field, but the work of the singers in radical staging is often to go not towards the conventions of operatic gestures, but to change these conventions, to disrupt in some way the many what is conventional in opera. So I think there are many insights in this book. For example, also Camilla Borg's chapter about portamento, about the relation between notation and the glissando technique in the violin. It's very interesting because it is a way of addressing the problem of the relation between notation and gesture, not from the point of view of the codified gestures, but when the gesture was not yet so common. So it is very interesting how notations was changing to take into account this new technique in some way, not during the 19th century, of course, and not today. This is also a perspective that is more than historical musicology, the musical treatise, but I think that all of this perspective can add something to the research of musical performance. And the same is true for the attempt that we did to add our chapters. Each chapter, they became a chapter in some way that they should have been in the book, but for many reasons they became some separate chapters, but they are connected to the 4 parts of the books. For example, we were declaring in our introduction that the first 2 chapters are in some way complement the first part, while Gianmario Borio's chapter was to complement part 3. This is because in some way, for example, the chapter by me and by Marco and me is a kind of attempt to give to ethnomusicologists and historical musicologists some fresh news, but we found that ethnomusicologists has performance as the main field of research, but it was in some way unconscious for most of the research. Now we are able to focus on performance as a specific aspect. So it was important to reconsider the history of ethnomusicology. And I tried to make the contrary, to take the new paradigms of performance studies and also of Nicholas Cook's performance turn and so on, to try to indicate some possible strategies for future research. So it was just a chapter that could in some way complement Clayton's chapter at the beginning of the book. So there is a connection, I think, but of course it is also true that as all these attempts to bring together, it is perhaps possible that the conjunction is something that is for the future, because we were aware of this and we tried to change the subtitle of the conference of 2016 that was towards a conjunction of ethnographic and historiographic research to more cautious, if you want, theoretical models and intersections, to say that the intersection is in the book, and some of the chapters, of course, they take into account the discussions of 2 seminars and 1 conference. This is a very important point. But the other thing is that I think that the book is very productive. For example, I was trying to, I don't know, I will not say to do the conjunction, but to work and to take ethnomusicological articles or ethnomusicological approaches and to apply them to the study of art music. I find this very productive, and I am aware of the fact that the book is the trigger of this kind of intersection. So I think that the intersection is something that can be a work in progress, so to speak. So the book is a kind of first step or third step, because we had the seminars and then the conference and then the book. But I think that it could be productive for the future. For example, I was in some way obliged and happy to see what ethnomusicologists and many of the names that we have in this book had said on different topics. So it was a kind of a trigger of new research. So to me, my experience is just that the book could be also in the future productive because it was the very point that we have ethnomusicologists and the historical musicologists together. I think it's something which is productive for research. So this is just my perspective. So I am happy to enlarge to hear Marco's position and also to involve all of you in the further discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening to all. Thank you to Amanda and Enrique for their presentation. And from the word of Amanda and Enrique, it's clear that the aim of this book is not to propose a single and shared definition of what musical performance is, but on the contrary, to emphasize we can find a wide range of different meanings, both in historical musicology and ethnomusicology, and consequently, a fan of different analytical approaches and theoretical models. Both Amanda and Enrique highlighted the importance of taking into account aspects such as the gesture, the role played by the gesture, and the body involvement in the musical performance, the aspect that is even more studied both from musicologists and ethnomusicologists, as well as the opportunity offered by the new technologies on the one hand from the analytical purpose, and as well as on the other hand, as well as some article focus on the role played by the media in modifying our perception of the musical performance. And another aspect I would like to stress is what we can, in a certain sense, consider as a long-term intersection. I mean that the performative term in historical musicology is often considered as a new paradigm dating back only a few decades. And on the one hand, it is obviously true. We all know that in the last year, an increasing number of historical musicologists have become interested in performance, and new theories and approaches have been developed, and important research projects on this topic have been carried out. But on the other hand, the book tried to show how the interconnection between ethnomusicology and historical musicology are more deeply rooted and developed over time. For instance, I'm thinking on the chapter by Martin Clayton, when he states from some researchers in both ethnomusicology and historical musicology, the empirical investigation of performance has long been an essential element of the serious study of music, end of quote. And so Martin Clayton presented a critical history of empirical methods in historical musicology and ethnomusicology, respectively, focusing mainly on a selection of sources relating to rhythm and time, demonstrating how we can find the first traces of this interconnection as early as the beginning of the 20th century. And another important aspect, I think, is we didn't speak about the process that originates the book. I'm very grateful to Giovanni and Gianmario for involving me in this project. And one of the things I learned while working on this book is how effective the process that led to the birth of this book was. In particular, the idea to organize the 3 preparatory conferences where historical musicologists and ethnomusicologists spend time together, share their studies, their experience, compared their whole point of view. This was this way of working has been, I think, a stimulus for some authors to rethink, to revisit, to reevaluate some of the previous works. This is the case of Philipp Auslander, whose chapter is entitled Musical Persona Revisited, where Auslander rethink is very known concept of musical persona. But it is also the case of Giovanni Giuriati, whose article focused on the case study of the Tarantella of di Montemarano. It is, as Enrique said, is a musical repertoire Giovanni Giuriati knows very well, and that he starts studying in the 80s, in the first period with a formal approach. So in his chapter, in this book, he rethink his first work and proposed a new combined approach in which the formal analysis interact with other fundamental factors involved in the music making, such as the spatial life of the music and the role played by the audience and by the dancer in the relationship between the musicians. And another aspect that emerged from the book and that I would like to highlight is that in a number of articles, both from ethnomusicologists and historical musicologists, studying musical performance means focus on the interaction between people making music. Interaction among the performers, interaction between the musicians and the audience, interaction between performers and composers, and so on. So I think in a certain way, we can say that this performative turn is a turn that switch from the idea of music as an object to an idea of music as a process, and a turn that bring to the performance as the result of a music-oriented interactive behaviors. And we can say in some way as that this performative turn is an ethnographic turn in this sense. But just Enrique spoke very well of my article, or to be more precise, the part of the article I shared with Alessandro. Just few words to say that I tried to offer an historical overview of ethnomusicological research on musical performance, and then that I tried not to create a rigid typology, but just to identify some trends. And I argue that 3 main analytical perspectives can be identified. The first one is consists in elaborating analytical models useful to identify the set of rules of a musical system through the comparison between a certain number of executions. And the second trend, the second approach, consists in investigating how the human body is involved in both music and dance performance. And the third one is the analysis of the relationship between sound and context. I think that in the variety of approach ethnomusicology, a theorist ethnomusicologists proposed for analysis of the musical performance, these 3 can be identified as the main trend to try to put a little bit of order in this variety of approach, research, and studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro and Marco. I am wondering if there are some questions from the audience, because I'm sure we don't see the entire audience, and are there questions coming with chat or messages? If not, we could go 1.5 hours. We could close. I don't see anything now. Okay, we can. Or are there any other comments? Giovanni, okay. No,
yes,
there are no questions from the audience.
Or maybe some of the people are on YouTube, and we can someone can relate us the question or the comments through the chat. I don't know. But in the meantime, if I may just make a very brief consideration. In a way, the time that passed since we started the project, and also the comments by our presenters today, in a way, make me even more convinced that, well, the title of the series is Musical Cultures of the 20th Century. And in a way, this approach has to do still with the 20th century, because this ethnographic and historiographic approach in the 21st century, as we heard also today, merge even more what, for instance, Amanda told us about the ERIMAS project, or the comment by the two presenters are not so easily can be labeled in one or the other field. So the attempt that was done in this book was to share as much as possible methods and perspectives on objects, and the object become more and more integrated, because it's the field of music, if we can call it that way, that is becoming more and more blurred and converging. Certain issues like cognitive process, study of sound and the oral, dealing with the statute of texts, the social interaction, music and familiarity and so on, are becoming more and more one field in which different approaches are taken, but with the possibility of integrating them and combining them more and more. So this, I think, this is a thought that from this presentation came out rather clearly. And just one brief comment about the issue of transcription. Is not me. I didn't write that sentence, but I'm sure that I can interpret the way it was written is not to deny the value of transcription, which is still a fundamental tool, but just to see that since the beginning of ethnomusicology, we said that transcription is not enough. And it was already Bartok that started saying this. And a way that comes out from the book, from a lot of papers, is that now with new technologies, we can integrate that, way of representing music with other tools that perhaps better reflect certain detailed aspects that written notation cannot account for. On the contrary, the example that you showed, I think, gave us the idea of how transcription can be so effective, especially in the learning process or in social interaction through music. And no one really can deny the value of writing it down so that it can become a way of negotiating and dialogue among musicians and among people. Just this.
Okay, thank you. I would ask Amanda and Enrique if you would like to add something or to integrate with some new thoughts before we finish our event of today. Amanda.
I was still intrigued, actually, because I don't think my question has been answered about the relationship between the e-chapters and the actual book, and because were they sort of afterthoughts, or is there a reason why they weren't included in the printed book?
Yes, I can say something, because we were let's say the major pattern of the book series is that the editors, especially if there are more than one, do not write own chapter. Because we try to reproduce these kind of interactions that happened in this long process. We form this group of scholars. We contact them about 2 years ahead. We exchange via email and other things. So there is a special interactions which is very focused on the work of the people invited into this group. This volume of the book series was special in some way because it required some kind because the question is so huge. Is the question of musical performance is the main question of musicology in general. So it required some kind of how to say, the considerations from outside, the reflections from outside, and paradigmatic is Alessandro's and Marco's chapter, which is really a kind of picture of what happened, what was discussed in the last quarter of a century, more or less. And in my chapter, I try to counterbalance this with a view on the history of music theory, because, you know, I read many times that music theory never really taught or explored the question of performance, and I found it wasn't true, and so I chose, you know, the late 19th century and the early 20th century in the mostly continental literature. To show how these questions was discussed, and also how slowly ethnomusicology entered into this field, which is typical for music history and music theory. And that was it. But then we have a certain size of the volumes that we have to keep. And we were many authors, many chapters, and then we had to choose this strange mixture of online and paper chapters, which I think it will be already some kind of review of the future development of our books series, more in the direction of online and open access. So we will see. We will see.
We're not planning another volume then?
Not on musical performance. We have other volumes.
Okay.
One just was published, The Female Voice in the 20th Century, and we have now other volumes planned. So, Enrique?
Yes, I just thanking you again, and having the possibility of having you, Marco, Gian Mario, Alessandro, Giovanni together. Perhaps I would like to say only a little thing and to put a little question. the thing is, I consider I would like I should have liked to find in the general index, in the general context, how it's called it, the contents, the names, the title as the names of your articles too, even if they are not on paper, they are on internet. I know what perhaps is something the editorial didn't allow you to do, but I consider that a little, you know, it should have been better, even if it's not on paper, to see that this is important part of the whole thing. And the other thing is just question. We talked, everyone was talking about historical musicology and ethnomusicology. And I asked you, do you consider popular music studies as a third area, or do we still consider it as an extension of ethnomusicology? In that sense, it is interesting that you point out the presence of other disciplines when you write that the project started with the conviction that searching for the integration of scientific experiences carried out in different fields and repertoires can contribute to a reciprocal influence of research method, not only historiographic and ethnographic approach, but popular music studies, performance studies, and music technologies, searching for a multi-level, integrative, and flexible perspective. And I think we could perhaps include at least music therapy in some of their, okay. So since I see in Spain, at least, and Latin America, that popular music studies is growing so quickly, and they are becoming, and they have JASPM and etc. But they come, or we do popular music studies too sometimes, no? Or classical. So okay, the limits are not frontiers, are horizons for our way of doing. But it's just a question about, do you consider this to be part of an ethnomusicological approach, or some new third or other way?
I just throw a quick answer, and then I pass on the floor. No, from my point of view, no, and also these, you know, these bilateral aspect. Ethnography and historiography was very connected with the beginning of the project, and the fact that Giovanni and I, as director of both institutes, one more concentrated on ethnic and folk music and oral tradition, and the other on papers. We have also an archive on music composition of the 20th century, how we can get an interaction, and performance is a common ground. And if we work together, we have to forget something, both of us. We have to forget or put into parentheses for a while the score of the text and things in terms of gesture, communication, and so on, and vice versa. The ethnomusicologists tend to put under parentheses or into the background certain major aspects and concentrate to something which is the bridge. And then in the course of the project, we got more and more aware that we have to do not only with two disciplines, but with several. And we have not to do with two genres, but several genres. And so we had one of the participants was also an expert of African American music, especially jazz, and then he didn't collaborate for the book. And then we had John Kovac for the rock music, and but these are in Schatzinger for electronics. There are some approach of these multifarious aspect. And yes, this is my answer. But Giovanni, I'm sure you have something to add to this.
No, well, in a way, I sort of answered with my previous one. Certainly, I do not think that popular music studies are part of ethnomusicology. I think that now the field of musicology is so diverse in a way and integrated, and each specificity has its own. Certainly, popular music studies are growing and are very important because also are dealing with music and media, which is something that little by little, even us ethnos more strict have to deal with. And so we can certainly benefit from their methods and their kind of approach. So in a way, the answer is no, but at the same time, I see a reconfiguration of the field of musicology that we will see in the next decades. And I don't know where it will go, because it's also, as I said, it's the object itself that is changing so fast that we have to cope with that that process.
Okay.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Very interesting.
Thank you for your questions, your comments. Each of these events is a step further, and I see that also with international exchange, which is one of the tenets of the book series, that many scholars with many backgrounds means also scholars coming from different countries. And this is what we are trying to improve, and this is also belongs to the DNA of the Fondazione Giorgio, to which both institutes, both music institutes belong. My only regret is that we couldn't do this event in person, which is, it belongs to a series, which is a wonderful series, Libri da San Giorgio. The title says already that staying for one day, one evening in San Giorgio is decisive for this. And I strongly hope that we can recuperate this with Amanda and Enrique in some of our future initiatives. As I told you, when we began, we are in a kind of gray zone now between the age of pandemic and the post-pandemic age. So it's very chaotic. We don't know. We have postponed a lot of activities, and we are starting slow, both institutes, to make our programs, to realize our programs. So I hope that 2022 will be the year where we can really be together again, which gives a totally other taste. But nevertheless, I'm happy of this event, and I wish you a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.